Welcome to the Learning Cosmos podcast. I'm your host, André Hedlund, educational psychologist, author, geek, and nerd. This show brings you science and learning through conversations with stellar people from different fields. Put on your spacesuits and hold tight. Our voyage into the learner's universe begins now. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Learning Cosmos podcast. And I am very honored to have one of the most cited psychologists in the world, I'd say, because you've revolutionized our understanding of cognitive architecture and how the brain learns. So, Professor John Sweller, thank you so much for saying yes to this podcast.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. And I would like to start from a very important question. I think our listeners, they have to be on the same page. So how do you define learning, Professor?
Okay. The answer to that is not, well, the simple answer to that is learning means there's been a change in long-term memory, in what's gone into long-term memory. But probably we ought to add to that by indicating the overall integrated cognitive architecture that allows that to happen. That architecture provides the base for cognitive load theory, which in turn provides a base for instructional design. Let me say a few words about human cognitive architecture
Sure.
because most people find that interesting. By human cognitive architecture, I mean, how do we learn? How do we think? How do we solve problems? And there are several closely related points that answer those questions. Firstly, categories of information. We tend not to categorize information. We tend to feel that one piece of information is very much similar to another piece of information, but they're not. We can divide information into two basic categories. First one is called biologically primary, and biologically primary information is information we've evolved to acquire over countless generations. There are lots and lots of examples of that, but probably the easiest and simplest one to understand is learning how to talk and how to listen.
Exactly. Yeah.
We've evolved to do that with respect to our native language. Second language is something else, but our native language, we've evolved, whatever the native language is, to listen to it and to speak it. I'll give you an example of the effect of that.
Yeah.
If we were asked to teach somebody how to speak, how to organize their lips, their tongue, their mouth,
Yes.
their voice, their breath, we couldn't do it.
Yeah.
And nobody does it. It's an immensely complicated thing. It's probably listening and speaking is probably the most complex thing that we learn. It's not taught in any school. We don't have to teach it.
It's
The only
acquired, right?
it's
Mostly
acquired.
unconsciously, right? Yeah.
It's acquired unconsciously. It's biologically primary. We've evolved to acquire it.
Yes.
Contrast that with learning to read and write.
Yes. Very different. Yeah.
They're very different. Keep in mind that we humans learned or developed reading and writing thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
Now, during that period, for the vast bulk of that period, almost nobody knew how to read and write. There was a tiny minority of any population that knew how to read and write. People didn't automatically develop reading and writing by being in a reading and writing society. Didn't make any difference.
Yeah.
If they weren't explicitly taught how to read and write, they did not learn how to read and write. The vast majority of most populations now know how to read and write
Yeah.
because about 150, 200 years ago, we developed mass education.
Perfect.
Everybody had to go to school, and once everybody had to go to school, most people learned to read and write. It was a different process. It is a different process to learning how to listen and speak.
So basically, Professor, to just to clarify, you're telling us that we can learn how to speak and listen to our native language more unconsciously by being immersed in an environment where people are using the language. But when it comes to
Exactly.
reading and writing, we have to be taught explicitly. So we have to have some kind of formal educational experience or at least somebody to tutor, to teach us, right?
And that is a terrific summary.
Great.
That's exactly what it is. And furthermore, these are just examples because we we developed schools precisely to teach that biologically secondary knowledge.
Yes.
Primary knowledge is knowledge we've evolved to acquire. Secondary knowledge is knowledge which we need for cultural reasons. But if we don't do something about people acquiring that knowledge, they won't.
Yeah.
And what we did about it was to develop schools. So if you want to know, or if you want to have examples of biologically secondary knowledge, just look at what's taught in any educational establishment. In
Perfect.
almost all cases, what they're teaching is biologically secondary knowledge. So that's the first major point that needs to be considered because it's frequently not considered.
Yes.
Secondly, how do we acquire knowledge? Well, that biologically secondary knowledge. How do we acquire biologically secondary knowledge? Well, there are two ways of doing it. One way is to work things out for yourself, problem solving
Problem
and
solving. Yeah.
problem solving. And ultimately, somewhere back in time, somebody had to work it out. Whatever we teach in schools was worked out by somebody,
Yeah.
and that was then taught in schools. So that's one way of doing it. And initially, all secondary knowledge comes from that source.
Yes.
I want to emphasize that our ability to problem solve is biologically primary. So we're using that biologically primary skill to develop biologically secondary knowledge. Okay,
Yes.
so
Yeah.
that secondary knowledge is coming can come via problem solving.
Yeah. And might we add, Professor, that this is usually something that takes time and it's done in, a collective way for a lot of the knowledge that we have produced because, people built upon what other people had built and that's why just to give you an example, it's quite difficult for students to work things out just like that, things that have
Extremely.
been, you know, they have been built upon knowledge that was built upon knowledge collectively over, if not thousands of years, at least centuries, right?
Yes, and that brings us
Yeah,
nicely to the second way in which we acquire knowledge.
yeah,
It's also biologically primary. It involves communicating information between each other. Pretty much
yeah,
what we're doing all the time. We're doing it now, and humans do it all the time. We're extremely good at it, and it probably explains why humans are the major mammalian species on Earth,
yeah,
because we have this skill of communicating, transmitting enormous amounts of information between each other. Other animals can transmit information between each other, but tiny amounts of it. We can
yeah.
transmit enormous amounts. And again, schools make use of this. That's the purpose of schools, to provide information to students that they really could not acquire themselves by problem solving.
Exactly.
And we can acquire enormous amounts of that biologically secondary information in that way. So, next set of points. Once we acquire information, whether it's by problem solving or from obtaining it from somebody else, we have to process it.
Yes.
And we have a special structure for processing novel information, and it's called working memory.
Perfect. Yeah.
And working memory has two restrictions, major restrictions. Restriction number one, we can only hold information in working memory without rehearsing it for no more than about 18 to 20 seconds. After
Yes.
that, it's gone. Okay, so if you think of a set of numbers in the old days when we used to dial numbers, you could look up a number and it would stay in working memory for about 18 to 20 seconds. And most of us know that. So if we know it's going to be longer than that, we keep repeating it to ourselves. If you repeat it
Exactly.
to yourself, you refresh it. So there's a there's a duration limit. Working memory has a severe duration limit,
Yeah.
won't hold information for more than 18, 20 seconds. Has
Yes.
another limit, and that's a capacity limit. It can't hold more than about 7 items of information at any given time,
Yeah.
and it
And
can't.
may sorry to interrupt, Professor. If you're talking about 7 items of information, so if we chunk information into meaningful bits, that means we can hold more information. So if for example, I'm looking at numbers, digits, and then suddenly there are four numbers that form the year 2025, for example. So that becomes
Yeah,
one chunk, and then we can
yeah,
hold,
yeah.
yeah, something like that,
That's
right?
right.
Yeah,
That's right. That's right. What constitutes a chunk depends on some of the next steps that I'm about to get to.
great.
Uh, but the major point now is we can only hold about 7 items of information. We can only process, by process I mean compare, work on in some way, 3 or 4 items of information,
Yeah,
no more than that. Four is a bit of a stretch for
yes.
most of us. So we can't process more than about 3 or 4 items of information. So working memory when dealing with novel information is extremely limited in capacity and duration. How do we function given those limitations? Well, the next step is if we think we're going to need information, we can transfer it to long-term memory.
Yeah.
Now, long-term memory, in contrast to working memory, we assume it must have duration and capacity limits, but if it does have them, we don't know where they are.
So we can assume it's almost infinite in a way,
Eh, We,
because
we can treat it as being
for,
infinite. Yeah,
for all
yeah,
human purposes, I think we don't need
yeah,
more capacity, right?
exactly.
Yes. Yeah.
We do not know where the limits are.
Yeah.
We don't know where they are. So long-term memory holds enormous amounts of information. We tend not to be aware of that normally because consciousness is closely associated with working memory. We're conscious with what's in working memory. We're not conscious of what's in long-term memory. I mean, intuitively we know, look, I'm thinking of a few things right now, but I know a lot more than that. But we can't hold all of that at once in working memory, so we're not conscious of it. So last point I want to make concerning human cognitive architecture. And this is the most important point, and it's a point you, in a way, alluded to earlier,
Yeah.
and it's a point that justifies the entire cognitive architecture. We can, once once information has been stored in long-term memory, it can be transferred back into working memory to govern action that's appropriate to whatever environment we're in. But working memory is now different to what it was when it was dealing with novel information. When working memory deals with familiar information that's been stored in long-term memory, it has no
Cons
limits.
Consolidated information, right? It's to
Consolidated
yeah,
information,
yeah,
it has no known limits. We
yes,
can transfer enormous amounts of information from long-term into working memory to govern action that's appropriate to our current environment. And that's the ultimate purpose of human cognitive architecture. So,
yeah,
cognitive load theory uses that system, and it's an integrated system, uses that system to design instruction. In other words, we take note of, are we getting kids to work things out for themselves, or are we presenting them with information? How much working memory capacity is taken up when they're dealing with that novel information?
yes,
We devise techniques to reduce the amount of information, unnecessary information that students have to deal with, so that they can deal with it properly in that limited working memory. Because keep in mind, a teacher who's presenting information, for the teacher, that information comes from long-term memory. There are
precisely. Yeah,
no working memory limits for the teacher. There are enormous working memory limits for the student,
yeah,
and we need to keep that in mind, and we need to organize instruction accordingly. And so cognitive load theory uses that cognitive architecture to devise instructional procedures.
yes.
There are
And
several.
yeah, I just wanted to add that you reminded me of when I was studying educational psychology at the University of Bristol. We talked about cognitive biases, and one of them is known as the curse of knowledge. When you have too much prior knowledge and things are easy for you, and you assume that your students will have it easy on them as well, and that's absolutely not true, because you're pulling this knowledge from your long-term memory, and then it's not really adding any cognitive load to your working memory, whereas students are receiving novel information, so you're adding a lot to their working memory, right, Professor?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. One of the things I used to tell my introductory teacher education students, don't go into your first class and tell the students everything you've ever learned.
Yes. That's a big mistake. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Because as a teacher, sure, it seems
Yes.
simple. It's easy. Yeah, you can all understand all of this easily. Uh, they can't. It takes years and years and years. But once we've learned it, it just seems simple to us because of that human
Yeah.
cognitive architecture. Once we've learned, and you started off by asking what is learning, once we've got
Yes.
stuff up in long-term memory, everything becomes simple.
Yeah.
Somebody with a lot of information in long-term memory in a given area can do things, can think about things in a way that is impossible for other people.
Yes. That is very
It's
true.
the, it's the magic of human cognitive architecture.
Yeah. And would it be fair to say that when teachers do that, when they basically make students listen to all they have learned, they are adding to the extraneous load. So they're imposing an irrelevant load to the student's working memory. And can you tell
Ex
us about the other types of load?
okay, let's talk about extraneous cognitive load. Extraneous cognitive load occurs when, and cognitive load effects are largely concerned with extraneous cognitive load. It occurs when you present students with information in a manner which makes it difficult for them to process because they've got that limited working memory when dealing with that particular information because it's novel to them. So, for example, if you present information to students via problem solving, which is what I talked about before,
Yeah.
there's an enormous cognitive load, extraneous cognitive load associated with problem solving. It's much, much easier to present people with the information. I mean, some problem, some problems have taken and do take people literally years to work out. You can tell people the solution to that problem in some cases, these are extreme cases, obviously, in a few seconds.
Yes.
You can, people can learn something in a few seconds that they could work out for themselves over several years. That's an extreme case. Problem solving requires processing a lot of information that you don't have to process if you're given that information to begin with. Now, when you're problem solving, you've got to work out, right, shall I try this move? Oh, I'm not sure. Maybe I should try it. You've got to think of the move. You've got to think what are the consequences of the move. And then after a lot of thinking about it, you realize, look, that's a dead end.
Yeah.
I'm not getting anywhere with that move. But all that time, what have you been doing? You've been using limited working memory resources to work out something which you could work out immediately if somebody told you the answer and how to do it.
Yeah. If somebody gave you direct instruction, basically, explicit teaching, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Explicit teaching,
Yeah.
precisely. The reason there's a considerable move towards explicit teaching around the world is precisely for that reason. It
Yes.
reduces working memory load. It makes it possible to direct your attention to exactly what you need to learn and not to, oh, do I do this? No, I don't do this. Is this other move a better move? Oh, look, it might be. I'm not sure. Let's try it
Yeah.
out. That's a long, slow process, and it's a process we tend to only use when we don't have information from other people, information which we either read or listen to. We can obtain information from others by either listening to what they say or reading what they wrote, and that can massively reduce unnecessary working memory load.
Is that why it's also called irrelevant load? Because it's just distracting.
It,
It gets in
yeah,
the way of what really helps you consolidate that memory. Yeah.
yeah, you can call it irrelevant. I mean, look, we for convenience sake we just use the term extraneous cognitive load, but yeah, it's irrelevant, extraneous. But there's another form of cognitive load which is more difficult to deal with, and that's called intrinsic cognitive load, and that's
Yes.
intrinsic to the information that you're dealing with. Some information is doesn't impose a heavy intrinsic cognitive load. I'll give you an example. If you're learning the nouns of a second language,
Yeah.
you can learn the translation of the word cat into Spanish, or you can
Mm.
learn the translation of the word dog into Spanish, and you can learn both of those independently of each other. They don't have to be learned together. You can learn one and not even think about the other one. The element interactivity, the extent to which the elements interact, is low. So intrinsic cognitive load is low. You can that there's a lot of work you've got to do. I don't
Yeah.
have to tell you how hard it is to learn the nouns of a second language.
Yeah.
It's a it's a enormous job that's going to take years in all
Yes.
probability.
Yeah.
It's not easy, but the intrinsic cognitive load is low because they don't inter the elements don't interact. Same if you're learning the uh, symbols of the chemical periodic table.
Sure.
You
Yeah.
can learn that Fe stands for iron and Cu stands for copper and all the rest of them independently.
Exactly. Yeah.
Element activity is low. But other forms of information we need to acquire, all the elements interact. There may not be all that many elements, but they interact. You can't learn one without learning the other.
Yeah.
If you're learning to solve an algebraic equation, A plus B all over C equals D, solve for A,
Yeah.
you can't change anything in that equation without taking into account every single element and the consequences of making the change on every single element. There's a very large number of elements. If you're just learning that to begin with, it overwhelms working memory.
Precisely. Yeah.
If you've already learnt it and it's in long-term memory for a competent mathematician, that
Yeah.
equation, A plus B all over C equals D, solve for A, that's a single element. They take it from
Exactly.
long-term.
It's a
Yeah, they
chunk.
take
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, they take it from long-term
Yeah.
memory, and they got lots of that sort of information in long-term memory.
Yeah.
And so intrinsic cognitive load can be high, extraneous cognitive load can be high, and between the two of them, it can be overwhelming for students. They can find
Yes.
it really difficult to learn. So that's the cognitive architecture, and that's the consequences of that cognitive architecture. And cognitive load theory has developed something like no, one and a half dozen uh, cognitive load theory effects, which indicate, look, if you do it this way, it's going to help students. If you do it this other way, it's going to make it difficult for students.
Yeah. So am I right to assume that we should simplify when we're dealing with intrinsic load, we can break it into, let's say, baby steps, simplify. When we're dealing with extraneous load, we should reduce or remove if possible.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that's right. Extraneous cognitive load ought to be eliminated. You can
Yeah.
eliminate it entirely. Intrinsic cognitive load shouldn't be eliminated, it should be optimized. If you
Yes.
eliminate it entirely, the students never learn because you have to learn how to do these complicated things that have to be done in a variety of subjects. I used algebra and mathematics as an example of high intrinsic cognitive load, but it applies in a lot of other areas. If
Yes.
you're learning history, well, what are the consequences of the First World War? You've got
Yeah.
a whole lot of various consequences, and they're not isolated, they all interact. There are a whole lot of interacting consequences which went together, caused the First World War, and had consequences after the First World War. So, if you're a historian, if you're learning history, you need to hold all of those at some stage in long-term memory. And sure, you can learn each one individually, but you need to subsequently learn to put them together. And if you don't learn to put them together, you haven't learned. So
Exactly. And that's when germane load comes in, and that's about the mental effort for you to actually consolidate that into long-term memory, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. You've got to put things together.
Yeah.
You've got to make sure. Germane load, we define it now as the working memory resources that are devoted to intrinsic cognitive load.
Yeah.
If you're devoting working memory resources to dealing with a high intrinsic cognitive load, that's ideal. That's what you want to do. If you've got to devote those same working memory resources, which are in low supply if you're a novice, if you've got to devote those to extraneous cognitive load, you can't devote them to intrinsic cognitive load. You're not learning. You're simply
Yes.
attempting to overcome the inadequate instruction that you're being given.
Precisely. And that brings me to a very, I'd say maybe controversial question, Professor, because there's a movement around the world. Here in Brazil, where I am based right now, is quite strong, I think. There are many constructivist schools like Montessorian schools, and they're based on self or guided discovery. So basically problem solving, right? And
Yeah.
you don't have so much direct instruction or explicit teaching. And I think many people believe that they might be more effective. Uh, so how do you see those schools that really
Yeah.
emphasize that kind of learning?
That there's an interesting history there because for certainly in a lot of the world, the last two generations in many countries, people have used a constructivist philosophy.
Yes.
It's better to construct knowledge for yourself rather than for somebody to give it to you. They've used that and it doesn't work.
Yeah.
There are several sources of information which indicate that it doesn't work. Firstly, you can run randomized controlled trials. In other words, you teach one group of students using explicit instruction.
Yeah.
Another set of students are required to learn the same material by working it out for themselves. So you randomly put students into one group or the other group, teach either by constructivist principles or by explicitly providing information. Then you give everybody a test.
Okay.
And almost invariably, if it's a properly randomized controlled design in the way in which I just described, you will find that the people who've been presented the information do better on the test, which is interesting because the people who were working things out for themselves, they were attempting to solve problems. Then you give them a test, which involves
Yeah.
problem solving, and they're worse at problem solving than the people who are not given practice at problem solving. So it's
Yeah. Interesting.
problem solving, incidentally, general problem solving strategies, they're all biologically primary. It's we can't teach them. If you
Yeah.
ask somebody to uh, provide you with a problem solving strategy, a general problem solving strategy that that's worth teaching to students, all I've ever got is silence after that question. There
Ah.
are no problem solving strategies. There, there are problem solving strategies. They're all biologically primary. We use them automatically. It's part of being human.
Yeah.
There's nothing we can teach. There's no general problem solving. You can't come to students and say, okay, here's a strategy which will help you solve every problem you ever come across. This is what you have to do.
Yeah.
There's no such strategy. There's nothing to teach there. So
I think one thing that is really important is for the students to have that long-term knowledge that is required for them to problem solve. Because what, I keep telling my students, so when you ask students to problem solve and then they have to go online and do some research or something like that, they're actually adding novel information to their working memory, right? And if they have to use that novel information to problem solve and it's not in their long-term memory, cognitive overload, right? So maybe
very difficult.
there you go. So you have to have that knowledge in your long-term memory so you can use that to problem solve because then you can pull it back from your long-term
Yep,
memory. Yeah.
exactly. You
Yeah.
can teach domain-specific problem-solving strategies. In other words, in this domain, in this area, if you want to solve this problem, this is what you do. Look, I gave the algebra example previously, A
Yeah.
plus B all over C equals D. You can teach people how to solve that sort of problem, and you need
Yeah.
to teach people how to solve that sort of problem. When you've got A plus B, which is the numerator, all over C, which is the denominator, the first thing you do is multiply out the denominator. You can teach that.
Yeah.
That's not going to help you in problems in any other area, but it'll help you on that problem, and you need to know how to solve that sort of problem, and it needs to be in long-term memory.
Precisely. And that brings me to another perhaps controversial question because it has to do with second language. And I know you wrote a paper with two French researchers, if I'm not mistaken, Stephanie Roussel and André Tricot, or something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I think it was a fascinating paper because, again, here in Brazil and all over the world, people are talking about English as a medium of instruction for higher educational institutions, and also CLIL, content and language integrated learning for secondary schools, even primary schools. And there is a notion, I think, especially among English teachers and this comes specifically from second language acquisition research, that teaching a language should be something more implicit, more unconscious, based on immersion. So, just put the students there in the classroom, uh, talk to them using the target language, the second language you're teaching, and they will acquire the language. And what insights can you share about that, Professor? Because according to your paper, that's not really the best way to do it, right?
Yeah, and the problem there is the failure to distinguish between biologically primary and biologically secondary knowledge.
Yeah.
We learn our first language through biologically primary techniques. If you want a normal kid to learn their first language, all you have to do is put them in that language environment. They will automatically pick it up. They'll learn how to listen, which is immensely complex. I mean, when you listen to a language, all you're hearing is modulating sounds. That's not what you're really hearing. What you're hearing is the language. And
Exactly.
that's because it's biologically primary, you'll pick it up. And until we realize the distinction between biologically primary and biologically secondary knowledge, it was so, in some ways, obvious that, okay, look how easy it is for kids to learn their first language. They ought to be able to learn as teenagers or adults. People should
Yeah.
be able to learn a second language in exactly the same way. All you have to do is put them in that language environment and they will learn it in the same way in which they learnt their first language. Doesn't work that way. After about 12, 13 years of age, we lose the ability to acquire language. We've evolved to acquire it by being immersed in a particular society for the first 12 to 13 years of our life.
Yeah.
And after that, can we learn a second language? Yeah, sure we can.
But then more explicitly.
Yep, we
Yeah.
learn it then as a biologically secondary task. And biologically secondary tasks, they need to be taught explicitly. We need to be given as many of the natural languages, some of them don't have as many rules as we would like them to have, but the rules they have, we need to teach the rules explicitly. We need to teach vocabulary explicitly. It all needs to be taught. Simply going into that environment and thinking that you're going to pick up a second language in the same way you picked up your first language. Doesn't happen. I grew up here in Australia where there were lots and lots of migrants, and I was aware of some migrants who'd come here as adults, were here their whole life. They never
Yeah.
learned English. And
And that
in
goes
a
even for biologically primary knowledge. So even though I already know the mental concepts, they're stored in my long-term memory for the meaning of the words, but I know them in my first language. And then when I learn them in a second language, that's already, prior knowledge, let's say. And even
yeah,
in that case, I have to learn explicitly. Even if I'm immersed in English or whatever second language is being used in the environment, I still have to make that explicit connection for the students
yeah,
to learn better.
that's correct. And you must explicitly and deliberately attempt to learn that second language. It won't, you didn't explicitly determine, oh, look, I'm going to learn my first language. It just happened
Yeah,
because it was biologically primary. You didn't have to explicitly make a decision. There were no decisions to make. It just happens. That's the beauty of biologically primary information.
yeah,
We've evolved to acquire it, and we acquire it easily and effortlessly and unconsciously. It just happens.
yeah,
Biologically secondary knowledge is not like that, and learning a second language as a teenager or an adult, that's biologically secondary.
yeah.
You're not going to pick it up automatically.
And so the paper, if I'm not mistaken, the paper shows that basically some students they had to listen to I think it was a lecture in either French or German two
Yeah,
times, French or French German or German French, German German, and then they were tested on their knowledge. So it was a rather complex issue. I think it was politics or human rights or something like that.
yeah. It was the legal system from
Yes.
well, yeah.
Yeah.
Legal system, with, politics and human
Yeah.
rights. Yeah,
And they were French natives, and then
that's correct.
so when they listened to the lecture in French and then in German, that was better than German because German was their second language. So they actually learned better when they first heard it in French and
Yeah,
then in German, and even better, of course, when they heard twice in French because
yeah,
that's their
yeah.
native.
Right.
Yeah,
That's right. And
yeah,
the if I recall correctly, the one
yeah,
of the interesting findings was that if they learnt it, they not only learnt the content better,
yeah,
their language skills improved more. So yeah, everything improved more. It's
yeah,
yeah, you we simply cannot assume that immersion, I mean, immersion won't do any harm, and it
sure,
may
yeah,
help. It may help a bit, but if you're not consciously attempting to learn that second language, it doesn't happen.
yeah.
And these are university students, so they were either late teens or early 20s. So it's at that age, you're not learning much that's biologically primary anymore. The
Yeah.
biological primary skills have all been acquired when you were younger.
That's very interesting, Professor, because I'm sure a lot of English language teaching professionals will listen to this episode and come back to me asking questions because this is really a controversial issue in Brazil and in many parts of the world, if especially because of the research of Noam Chomsky and Stephen Krashen back in the 60s, 70s, and second language acquisition, more implicit. But then again, they had looked at research done by neuroscientists that came before them, and they were looking at first language, not really second language. I think it was
Yeah, yeah,
Krashen kind of borrowed that from Eric Lenneberg and then applied to second language learning or acquisition, as he said. And And nowadays, there are many bilingual schools in Brazil and around the world that they actually believe that if we teach through immersion, so we just use the target language that they're learning, and we combine that with content, then as you said, you're killing two birds with one stone, right? And then they're going to learn both better. But apparently, that's actually increasing the cognitive load, and they
Uh,
might not be
but
learning effectively at all.
unless unless they
Yeah.
actively try to learn that second language,
Yes. Yes.
they
Not
are
just by
they're
being passively listening to what's going on, but actually making an effort, a conscious effort to learn the language.
exactly
Yeah.
it we we can show again and again and again using randomized controlled trials,
Yeah.
you will learn less of the whatever topic is being covered, you'll learn less of the language
Yes. Precisely.
rather
Even the
than killing
language. Yeah.
yeah, rather than killing two birds with one stone, you're not killing any birds either.
Well, yes, precisely. Well, Professor, we're moving towards the end of this episode. I mean, I could probably spend the whole day talking to you about such amazing and interesting topics, but I wanted to ask you about what do you think teachers should be worried about when they're designing their instructions, they're planning their lessons. I mean, cognitive load is something that they have to learn more about so they can be more effective as instructors and teachers. But do you have any final tips or something to help them? Because I think teachers are overwhelmed as it is, it's not an easy job. So what
No,
can help them? Yeah.
it's not an easy job.
Yeah.
Look, the main thing I would like teachers to learn about more than they're learning about now is precisely that human cognitive architecture that we started with.
Yeah.
It tells us an awful lot. Teachers tend not to be taught that architecture, which I hasten to emphasize is not anybody's fault because our understanding of that architecture is relatively new. Some of the elements go back a long way in the sense that we've known about the limits of working memory for many decades,
Yeah.
but we haven't understood the effects of long-term memory on working memory nearly as well. And it's only really been relatively recently, 2, 3 decades, that the concept of the concepts of biologically primary and secondary knowledge and the distinction between them have been made. We didn't know about those. And without knowing about those, the entire education systems around the world, in a way, were flying blind.
Yeah.
We just assumed, we could see, look, look how easy it is for people to learn things outside of school and how hard it is to learn things in school. All we have to do is make schools more like the outside world and people learn easily and automatically. And we didn't realize, look, the reason it's so much easier to learn things outside of school is because the things we're learning outside of school are quite different. We developed
Yes.
school in order to teach things which students don't learn outside of school.
Yes.
So I hope that more and more teachers learn about that cognitive architecture. The individual bits of that architecture, they're important, but the way they integrate together, it's a unified whole. And that unification gives you an understanding of what you ought to do and what you should not do when teaching.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Professor. It's been an honor, a pleasure. I will make sure to link some of your papers so that those teachers who are listening to us can learn more about that connection between working memory, long-term memory, cognitive architecture. And well, everybody stay tuned for more Learning Cosmos podcast episodes. And again, Professor John Sweller, thank you so much. This has been very special, especially because, as a student of educational psychology, I had to read many of your papers, back in Bristol. So thank you so much.
And thank you for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Wonderful. Thank you.